In this town, porch lights switched off by 9, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries with little more than a nod. Nothing ever seemed out of place. But tonight, something was about to change. A gray Lincoln sedan cut through the mist, its headlights casting eerie beams across the road. Behind the wheel sat Margaret Ellis, a 68-year-old woman whose dignity seemed to radiate from her every pore. Her hands gripped the wheel with quiet strength as she drove, her eyes fixed ahead. But beneath that composed exterior, a storm was brewing, a deep grief over the loss of her beloved husband Robert, who had passed just a week ago. This night was meant to mark the beginning of healing, a quiet vigil for the man who had shared her life for 42 years. But grief is never easy, and it was a silent companion on her drive home. The Lincoln passed under the glow of a street lamp, and that's when she saw it, flashing lights in her rearview mirror, a police SUV. At first, she dismissed it, telling herself it was just a coincidence, another officer patrolling the quiet streets of Silver Creek. But as she turned down Cottonwood Drive, the SUV followed. One turn became two, and by the third, Margaret knew this was no accident. Her pulse quickened, but she stayed calm. She clicked on her hazard lights, slowed the car, and eased to the curb, the vehicle coming to a gentle stop beneath the harsh glow of the street lamp. The patrol car pulled in behind her. Margaret didn't move. She was a woman who had lived through more than most, but nothing prepared her for what was coming next. The sound of the police SUV's door slamming echoed through the quiet street, followed by the crunch of heavy boots on wet concrete. A flash of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trunk of Margaret's car, then gliding over the window before settling on her face. She remained still, her gaze unwavering, hands resting calmly in her lap, every movement deliberate, controlled. Officer Haley Dunn, young and sharp, approached her car with a brisk stride, a flashlight gripped tightly in her hand, its beam aimed straight at Margaret. "Driver, roll down your window," came the order, sharp and without a hint of warmth. Margaret's hands moved slowly but steadily, reaching for her wallet and the registration on the passenger seat. She placed them there, visible and clear, as if to say, "I have nothing to hide." As she did, her eyes met Haley's. The officer's stare hard, unyielding, like a predator sizing up its prey. Margaret didn't flinch. She had lived through enough to know the look of suspicion, the cold glance that didn't see a person, but a problem. "License and registration," Haley demanded again, the words more in order than a request. Margaret gestured toward the papers on the seat, her voice even as she spoke. "They're right there, officer." But Haley didn't reach for them right away. Instead, she stood frozen, eyes narrowing, studying Margaret with a lingering gaze. "What brings you to this neighborhood tonight?" Haley asked, her voice colder now, probing not the simple question of a traffic stop, but an interrogation. Margaret's calm voice filled the air. "I live here, just heading home from a vigil for my husband. He passed last week." The words hung in the air for a moment, their weight palpable. Haley's flashlight flickered in her hand as the pause stretched between them. But then came the question that made the tension snap like a taut wire. "These Georgia plates, when did you move here?" "3 months ago," Margaret answered, her tone still steady. "To be near my son." There was a beat of silence, a shift. Then, with chilling finality, Haley snapped, "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." The command wasn't a request, it was a decree. Margaret's heart rate picked up, but she remained composed. She'd been through worse, but this felt different. This wasn't just a stop, this was something else, something darker. Margaret's fingers tightened around the steering wheel for just a moment, a flicker of recognition flashing through her mind as the officer's words hit her like a cold slap. She wasn't blind to what was happening. This wasn't a routine stop. This wasn't about a broken taillight or a forgotten signal. This was power, pure and simple, being wielded with cold precision. Slowly, deliberately, she unbuckled her seatbelt. Her movements were measured, calculated, no sudden jerks, no hasty actions. Her age and grief made quick movement dangerous, but it was more than that. She had lived through far worse than this, and she was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. As she opened the door, the sharp voice of Officer Haley Dunn barked at her. "Hands where I can see them!" The command rang out like a gunshot, and Margaret complied, raising her hands just enough to show she wasn't a threat. She wasn't foolish. She had learned long ago that every action, every movement could be twisted, manipulated. Haley's flashlight cut through the fog, swinging from Margaret's face to her chest, the beam harsh and unrelenting, forcing Margaret to squint against its blinding glare. "Where were you headed again?" Haley asked, the suspicion in her voice now full blown, as though Margaret were already guilty. "I told you," Margaret said, her voice unwavering. "Home, 2 blocks over." She kept her tone neutral, but there was a steel beneath the calmness, something unspoken but felt in the air between them. Haley stopped, her boots crunching against the wet pavement as she circled the car slowly, eyes scanning every inch of it like a predator sizing up its prey. "Why didn't you pull over sooner?" she demanded, her voice now dripping with thinly veiled hostility. "I wasn't aware I needed to," Margaret replied, her words as controlled as ever, but the slight edge of defiance creeping in. "You followed me. I stopped as soon as your lights went on." Haley's jaw tightened, the accusation forming in her mind. "You were swerving," she spat, casually rewriting the narrative. Margaret clenched her teeth, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't going to back down. Not tonight. Not ever. Haley wasn't interested in the truth. This was about something else, about power, about control, and Margaret was not going to give in to it. And as Haley moved closer, too close, the flashlight now aimed directly at her chest, Margaret felt a flicker of something older than anger, something deep, familiar. It was the feeling of knowing she wasn't going to get out of this easily. But she wasn't afraid. Not yet. Not ever. Jim Hartley stood in the dim light of his living room, the steam from his evening tea swirling in the air as he watched the scene unfold across the street. He had lived in Silver Creek for over 60 years, seen all sorts of things, but tonight felt different. He could see the flashing lights, the sharp angles of the officers' movements, and the coldness in the way Officer Haley Dunn was handling Margaret. There was no kindness, no questioning, no understanding, just raw power. Something was wrong. He had seen it too many times before, but this time it felt personal. He knew this wasn't just a routine stop. He could feel it in his bones, the tension thick enough to slice through the air. He didn't have a reason to be involved, but his instincts told him otherwise. Without thinking, he reached for his phone, thumb moving over the screen as he hit record. His hands were steady, his eyes focused through the window as the conversation between Margaret and Haley escalated. He could hear the harshness in Haley's voice, the way she demanded compliance. The way Margaret responded with that quiet dignity that had carried her through a lifetime of challenges. He knew that what he was recording could be important. It wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a moment in time, a crack in the system that might not be seen unless someone pointed it out. So, Jim stood there in his cozy living room, phone steady in his hands, capturing every second of the exchange. He watched as Haley leaned closer, flashlight now directly aimed at Margaret, demanding answers, threatening escalation. But Margaret, unflinching, stood her ground. Jim's mind raced as he thought about the implications. If Margaret didn't speak up, if no one else did, this would just be another story buried under the weight of silence. But tonight, he wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to let Margaret's calmness in the face of injustice be ignored. His phone continued to record, capturing the unraveling of a situation that was about to change everything. As the seconds dragged on, the tension in Silver Creek's quiet streets was palpable. Jim Hartley's phone continued to record, capturing every moment, every flicker of movement. The flashing red and blue lights painted the neighborhood in harsh strokes, making the otherwise tranquil houses look like silhouettes of a long-buried secret being uncovered. Inside Margaret's car, everything had shifted. What began as a simple traffic stop had now turned into something far more dangerous, and Haley Dunn's aggression had become unmistakable. Her eyes were narrow, cold, as she barked orders at Margaret, pushing her further into a corner, trying to provoke a reaction. Any reaction, to justify her escalating control. Jim watched as the second officer, Ray Collins, arrived on the scene, his bulky frame stepping out of his squad car and immediately falling in line with Haley. Jim knew this officer, knew his reputation. A man who preferred to stay out of the limelight, but couldn't ignore what was unfolding in front of him. He wasn't the type to make waves, but as Jim's camera kept rolling, he could see the uncertainty flash in Collins' eyes. Something wasn't right here. But he didn't speak up. Not yet. "Do you mind if we search your car?" Collins asked Margaret, his voice betraying an air of discomfort, but Haley's gaze hardened, waiting for her partner's support. Margaret, unwavering, shot back with a single word: "I do." Her voice was calm but steely. "I haven't done anything wrong, and you have no cause." Haley, not willing to let up, reached for her radio, pressing the button firmly and calling for backup. Her tone was clipped as she spoke into the mic, demanding further assistance, escalating the situation, even though Margaret had not once raised her voice. Across the street, Jim's breath hitched. He knew what this meant. A routine stop had transformed into a spectacle of power, an injustice unfolding with each passing moment. His thumb hovered over the screen, knowing he had to capture this. No one would believe what was happening otherwise. The video he was recording was more than a tool. It was a lifeline, the only way to expose the truth. With every minute that passed, the quiet of Silver Creek was replaced by the noise of a town waking up to the realities it had ignored for too long. And as backup arrived, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Jim's hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to unfold. This was history in the making, and it was happening right before his eyes. The tension in the Silver Creek police station was palpable as Chief Raymond Holstead paced in his office, his thoughts swirling like the storm clouds outside. He'd received the phone call just moments ago, and now everything felt off balance. This wasn't just about a routine traffic stop gone wrong. This was an emergency, a situation that threatened to shatter the town's fragile sense of peace. The footage Jim Hartley had recorded was everywhere, flooding social media, news outlets, and even the streets of Silver Creek. The video was undeniable. Margaret Ellis, calm and composed, had been humiliated by Officer Haley Dunn, and now the entire department was under scrutiny. Holstead knew the storm was coming, and he knew it was going to hit hard. His footsteps echoed in the hallway as he stormed toward the holding area, his face tight with resolve. He couldn't ignore this any longer. As he passed the officers in the bullpen, their eyes avoided his. The air was thick with tension. Everyone knew that something had gone terribly wrong, but no one knew how deep the rot went. He reached the back hallway, where Haley was waiting, her back stiff, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her uniform as she stared down at the floor. Holstead's voice sliced through the silence. "Where is she?" "She's in holding, sir," the sergeant replied, his voice barely a whisper, as if not daring to speak too loudly. Holstead didn't say another word. He moved swiftly to the door of the holding room, opened it, and stepped inside. There, sitting alone at the metal bench, was Margaret Ellis, still dignified, still unwavering. She looked up at him as if she had expected him to come. For a moment, the world outside the station seemed distant, and all Holstead could hear was the steady beat of his own pulse. "Miss Ellis," he said, his voice quieter now, more respectful. "This situation will be resolved immediately." He turned to the officer at the desk. "Remove the cuffs. She's free to go." As the cuffs clicked off, Margaret didn't move immediately. Her hands, still slightly reddened from the tight restraints, rubbed her wrists gently. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes. Holstead looked at her for a long moment before turning away. As the door clicked shut behind him, the weight of the situation settled heavily in the air. He knew the department had been exposed, and things were never going to be the same. The quiet of Silver Creek was shattered the moment Mayor Julian Ellis stepped into the spotlight. His face, usually calm and composed, now wore the unmistakable mark of righteous fury. He had spent the evening pacing, trying to collect his thoughts, but the moment he heard his mother's name, Margaret Ellis, it was as if the ground beneath him had cracked open. The phone call from the station had been the tipping point. His mother, a woman who had spent her entire life lifting others up, was now the victim of an egregious act of racial profiling. It wasn't just a personal assault. It was an attack on everything he stood for. And the injustice wasn't going to go unnoticed. Julian stood at the podium, his hands resting firmly on the edge. The room was packed, reporters jostling for position, cameras flashing as they waited for him to speak. The weight of the moment pressed against him, but he didn't flinch. "Last night," he began, his voice steady but filled with the quiet strength that had earned him his position, My mother, Margaret Ellis, was wrongfully detained and humiliated by one of our own police officers. She was treated with suspicion simply because of the color of her skin. His words hung in the air like a declaration, something that couldn't be taken back. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing every syllable, every movement. This isn't just about my family, he continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, making sure they understood. This is about every black mother, every person who has ever been treated like a threat in their own neighborhood. It's about accountability, and it starts today. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, the room fell silent. His voice rang out again, louder this time, as he leaned forward into the microphone. We will not tolerate this. Not in my town, not under my watch, not anymore. Outside, a crowd had gathered, their voices rising in solidarity. The anger was palpable, but so was the hope that something was finally being done. Julian's words had set something in motion, something that could no longer be ignored. The spark had been lit, and Silver Creek, for all its history of silence, was about to speak out. The streets of Silver Creek were alive with an energy that hadn't been seen in decades. People were no longer walking with their heads down, eyes averted. Now they stood tall, their voices rising in a chorus of demands for change. Margaret Ellis had become the symbol they had been waiting for, quiet, dignified, yet unyielding. The video of her arrest had gone viral, sparking outrage that rippled far beyond the confines of the small town. It wasn't just a woman wrongfully detained, it was a call to action, a loud, painful reminder of how far the system had gone wrong. In the town hall, the atmosphere was electric as residents packed into every corner, all eyes on the stage where Julian stood. He had been speaking passionately for hours, laying out plans for reform, for holding those in power accountable. But now, it wasn't just about policy, it was personal. As he looked out over the crowd, Julian could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The room was filled with people who had suffered in silence for far too long, and now they were ready to demand their dignity back. Outside, the protesters had gathered in front of the police station, their signs held high. Justice for Margaret read one, while another simply said, "We see you." The streets were filled with the sound of drums and chants, people who had never before considered speaking out now standing side by side, their voices unified in defiance. And at the center of it all stood Margaret, a quiet presence who wasn't leading the crowd, but whose very existence demanded that change happen. She had raised a son who understood the fight, and now the fight was hers to continue. But even as the crowd roared outside, there was still the painful reality that change would not come easily. There would be resistance, there would be pushback, but Margaret knew one thing with certainty: she would never again stay silent. Not while there were people still afraid to speak. The town was waking up, and the change they sought had finally begun to take root. The courtroom was suffocating, thick with anticipation. The air felt too still, too heavy, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Every seat was filled, every eye trained on the door, waiting for the moment that would set the course for Silver Creek's future. It wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. Officer Haley Dunn stood on one side of the room, her back straight, jaw clenched, but there was no hiding the weight of the accusations pressing down on her. She was no longer just a police officer. She was the embodiment of everything the town had been blind to for far too long. Across the room, Margaret Ellis sat, her posture impeccable, eyes steady as she looked straight ahead, but inside, her heart thundered. This was not just about the handcuffs, the humiliation, or the false accusations. It was about what they had all failed to see, the way the system had allowed power to be abused, how people like Haley had been allowed to operate without question. She wasn't afraid. She had buried a husband, raised children, and stood up against injustice her entire life. Tonight, she was doing the same. The jury filed in, their expressions somber, knowing this wasn't just any case. They weren't deciding the fate of one officer. They were deciding the fate of the town itself. The testimony began, and each word, each recounting of what had happened that night seemed to reverberate through the room, shaking the very foundation of everything the department had stood for. Jim Hartley's video played, its rawness piercing through the silence like a blade. There was no denying it. The footage didn't lie. It showed the truth. Haley Dunn had abused her power, had humiliated Margaret in front of her own home in a quiet street where no one expected anything to go wrong. The room was still when the verdict came in, the weight of it hanging over everyone like a storm cloud. Guilty. It was a word that changed everything. It wasn't just a victory for Margaret. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been treated as less than human, for everyone who had felt the sting of an unjust system. As the gavel slammed down, the tension in the room broke, but outside, the air was filled with something else: hope, the beginning of real change. The doors of the Ellis Center for Community Justice swung open with a force that seemed to echo across Silver Creek. It was more than just a building, it was a symbol, a tangible manifestation of the fight Margaret Ellis had started, a place where the voices of the silenced would no longer be ignored. As she walked through the center's entrance, her hands rested gently at her sides, the weight of everything she had been through settling in the calm of the moment. The halls, once empty and cold, now buzzed with activity, people moving purposefully, exchanging ideas, offering help. In the corner, a group of law students gathered, eagerly discussing cases of racial profiling they were working to expose. In another room, retired community leaders met with young activists, the generational divide shrinking as they shared their wisdom and passion for change. Margaret had envisioned this place not as a monument to her, but as a legacy for the entire town, a space for healing and progress. She wasn't here for accolades or recognition. She was here to build something that would outlast her, something that would keep the fight for justice alive long after the headlines faded. The walls were lined with photos from marches, memorials, and community gatherings, silent reminders of the battles fought and the victories earned. But there were no trophies here, no banners of personal achievement. Every inch of the building was a testament to the collective power of Silver Creek's people coming together to reshape their future. As Margaret stood by the windows, watching the stream of people walking in and out, she couldn't help but smile. The center had become more than she'd ever dreamed. It was a living, breathing movement, one that would continue to grow, evolve, and inspire, just as she had hoped. And in that quiet moment, with the sun filtering softly through the glass, Margaret knew that this was only the beginning. This was a place where justice would no longer be an afterthought, but a force to be reckoned with.